Let me close this a little bit. I've got too much going on the screen. I'm sorry, I've got some things popping up on the screen that caused my computer to act kind of strange here. Sit.
I'll just take a minute to put in an advertisement. Next week, we're doing Queer Housewives and House Husbands of New Jersey, and it's really fascinating to see how marriage progressed and went backwards in time and how long this has been going on for. That's my commercial.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I think people are muted.
Okay, that's fine. Excellent.
I can hear you. I don't know about the rest of them.
So we are going to present and discuss the indigenous people of Shayikpi. Many people don't know this, but that is actually the indigenous, the Lenape name for the area that we call New Jersey today. Shayikpi literally means by the water's edge, and as we know, the state has water on 3 of its sides, and we are bordered not only by the Atlantic, but also by the Lenape-Iwahittuck, which is what is today called the Delaware River, and the Pawtucket, which is the Delaware Bay. The symbol that you see is actually the symbol of my tribe, the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape, and I'll talk a little more about my tribe as we go through this presentation. One of the things that I'm often asked when I make reference to indigenous people is, how do we prefer to be called? What do you call a Native American? And there are a lot of people who have become sensitive to using the term American Indian there, and so people are very interested and concerned because they don't want to offend. The sad thing is that I really can't answer the question, and the reason is because it varies from individual to individual. Usually indigenous is well accepted, and the reason that you will hear me use Indian often is not because I necessarily think that it's historically accurate, but because that is how we refer to ourselves at the national and federal level. The national leadership that comes together uses that term because that's the term that is in treaties, that is the term that is used in federal Indian law. And so we often use that. I have no problem with that term. There are some who do. Native American actually could apply to anyone who's born here. And so there are some indigenous people, tribal people, who don't necessarily want to use that either. First Nations people is used in Canada, and often you'll hear that term being used here in the United States. But the best way to refer to a person who's indigenous is to find out what tribe they're from and to refer to them as being part of that tribe. So if you were to ask me what I am, I would say I'm Nanticoke Lenape. As we continue, the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape people actually are a combination of 2 tribes that have a history in the region. And the Lenni-Lenape, or the original people referred to as the grandfathers or the ancient ones, are actually the ancestors of many of the Algonquian-speaking tribal nations. In fact, our claim is that we're the ancestors of all of the Algonquian-speaking tribal nations. There are tribes that refer to us as the ancient ones. I was traveling, representing my tribe at a national meeting, and one of the chiefs of the Ottawa in the Great Lakes saw my name tag, and he was old enough to be my father, but referred to me as one of the ancient ones because they acknowledged our tribe as the ancient root from which their tribe sprang. One of the things that people get confused about is that I'll be using the term Lenni-Lenape or Lenape, and people have also heard about the Delaware Indians. Well, that's the name that was given to our people by the British, because we were by the Delaware River and Bay that the British had renamed after the governor of Virginia, the British governor of Virginia, Lord Delaware. So the Indians down the river were called Delaware, and the Indians around the bay were called the Delaware Bay Indians. And so that name kind of stuck and is maintained and kept, especially by those who were forced further and further west and are now out in Oklahoma. That is the tribal name that they often will use. The Nanticoke actually from the Delmarva Peninsula originally, and they came from the Lenape in ancient times, and the Nanticoke territory was across the central Delmarva. And so the two tribes, not only having historically been related, but also at the time of contact and dealing with colonization, intermingled yet again, intermarriage happened. And our families of the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape are a combination of the two tribes. The traditional Lenape territory extended from the southwestern portion of Connecticut, the southeastern portion of New York, all of New Jersey, the portion of Pennsylvania that it borders the Delaware River, and into northern Delaware down to the other side of the bay. Our people survived the early colonial incursion, but it was with great difficulty. One of our chiefs said, for every one of the Europeans that gets off one of the great boats, 9 of our people die. We died through disease that we had no resistance to. We died through conflicts. And so our population was greatly diminished within the first 100 years of contact. During that time period, however, in the early stages, we maintained dominance in the region, and we were the ones that actually hosted the New Sweden colony and had treaties and gave land grants to the Swedes, also to the Dutch, and then to the English. We had some conflict with the Dutch, and our Nanticoke ancestors actually had some conflict with the English, but we did not have any conflict with the Swedes. New Sweden was in southern New Jersey, southeastern Pennsylvania, northern Delaware, and was replaced more or less by the English when they came. One of the things that a lot of people don't know about is the doctrine of discovery, which was the backdrop, the philosophy, the mentality of many of the colonists that came here. It is based in papal bulls from the 1400s, and we see that it gave permission to any Christian monarch to lay claim to lands that were not held by another Christian monarch, and to actually vanquish and enslave the non-Christian inhabitants. And so when the colonial powers initially began to lay claim to the Americas, this was the backdrop that they had in how they could make those claims. And while there were land grants and treaties cut, they tended to be in accordance with the traditions of those that were arriving, as opposed to the traditions of those who held the land. For my people, the concept of land ownership was very different. The Creator actually owned the land. We were the stewards over the land, but they were given to us to possess, and that we had an obligation to care for and share with those who came among us and respected that relationship. And so really the concept of selling was very foreign to us, selling land. What the concept that we held to was that you would have to renew your relationship on a regular basis to live and stay upon the land which the Creator had given us to possess. So a lot of people talk about how the Lenape sold Manhattan for some beads and trinkets, and that really wasn't the case, because in our tradition, it was never sold. It was a reaffirmation of the agreement that the colonists could dwell and live in our territory, and that had to be renewed through gift-giving diplomacy. So a very different understanding of land tenure that caused quite a bit of confusion and difficulty. Some of the early dealings, however, with the English were with the Quakers down in South Jersey. There was a time when New Jersey was actually two colonies, East Jersey and West Jersey. The southern portion of the state was primarily called West Jersey. Our people initially had a pretty good relationship with the Quaker community that came in, with John Fenwick and the Fenwick colony, who established treaties with our chiefs back in the 1670s. By the 1680s, William Penn, the governor of Pennsylvania, the English governor, met with our chiefs, council of chiefs, in a place called Shackamaxon. Today, there is, commemorating that, a park called Penn Treaty Park in Philadelphia. A lot of people that go there have no idea of the history and the significance. But William Penn met with our chiefs. We had selected a spokesman of the chiefs named Tamanend. And the wonderful thing was that William Penn actually learned our ways and it understood how we held council meetings and how we cut treaties. So he commissioned a wampum belt to be made, which is a woven belt with cone-shaped shell beads. And patterns would be woven in as a witness or testimony to an agreement or a special event. And so he had a wampum belt made. And of course, according to our tradition, we had one made, and there was an exchange of belts for this Treaty of Amity, where William Penn's design was to live in peace and harmony with the Lenape and to become as though we were one blood. And Chief Tamanend indicated that we would keep the treaty as long as the creeks and rivers run and while the sun, moon, and stars endure. The photograph you see is of the wampum belt given by our chiefs to William Penn, and it demonstrates the communion that we were hoping to be able to establish with the Quaker community. Our tribe has kept that treaty, and we still have a relationship with the Quaker community in our area, with the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and the various meeting houses that are connected to it. Unfortunately, William Penn, his sons, violated the treaty with what's called the walking purchase and swindled our chiefs out of a huge swath of land in Pennsylvania. Something that is not, beg your pardon? Something,
go ahead.
Something that is not well known is that our people actually were hunted for profit. In 1678, in the Maryland colony, which included Delaware at the time, an enemy Indian was anyone who did not cry aloud and give some sign of surrender if they came within 300 paces of an Englishman's cleared ground, or if an English person came upon them as they were walking in the woods, or if an Englishman saw them and they were painted, in other words, had some ceremonial paint upon them because they were involved in ceremony, and they didn't immediately lay down any weapons that they may have been carrying. Anyone that fell into these three categories was declared an enemy and could be killed by any of the English colonists and get a bounty. And by 1763, the bounty was as high as 50 pounds, which was a significant amount of money in that day. And there was no distinguishing between the elderly or the young, men, women, or children. There were quite a few of our people that fell because of this policy. The first reservations were actually established here in the East. I know a lot of people, when they think about American Indian reservations, they think about being out in the Great Plains or in the Southwest, but actually the earliest ones were here in the Northeast. And the oldest continuous powwow was on an old reservation up in Rhode Island with the Narragansett. There are reservations that have continued from the colonial area up in New York and down in Virginia. And there were reservations in Maryland and Delaware, and there was an official reservation here in New Jersey called Brotherton in Burlington County, and there were many unofficial, locally established reservations that were commonly referred to in the early days of the colonial era as Indian towns or Indian fields, where our people were supposed to be able to live unaccosted. By and large, the reservations failed. Our land was coveted by the new colonists, and they began to push us further and further off the land that had been set aside. We were blessed in southern New Jersey because of the relationship that we had with the Quaker community, and also those that were further south had relationships locally that we were able to stay. I'll talk a little more about that. But by 1740, what's interesting is the vast number of Nanticoke and Lenape people were pushed out of this area. They were continuously pushed further and further west. They would go into Pennsylvania and settle, and then they would be pushed further because of the desire for land by the colonial powers and later by the federal powers, so much so that there are many Lenape people now living out in Oklahoma with 2 federally recognized tribes, a tribe up in Wisconsin that has our people, mostly those that were among the Muncie, the northern part, and also those that were part of the disbanded Brotherton Reservation in central New Jersey, wound up with that community up in Wisconsin, and many of our people wound up in Canada also. And there are continuing communities there of Lenape or Delaware people. Those of us who remained wound up being reclassified. In the mid-1740s, the definition of Indian began to change because the local authorities did not want to have to honor any continuing treaties. And the easiest way to do that was to say there was no one with which they needed to keep a treaty. So they began to reclassify us. So an Indian was reclassified as a non-Christian living in the woods and eating primarily deer meat. And that meant that any of my ancestors that had adopted Christianity, had been baptized, were living in a European-style home and eating chicken and pig, they were suddenly no longer considered Indians, and they were reclassified as free persons of color, or mulatto, instead of Indian. Those also that they're in Delaware, they went even further in 1770 and defined an Indian as someone who was living far away from the state of Delaware. So we see that there was a push to reclassify our people, and this misclassification continued in other public records straight into the modern era, so much so that as recently as 2007, in a study that was conducted by executive order here in the state of New Jersey, there are tribal families that talked about having their children's school registration changed by school officials when they checked off that they were actually members of the tribes that are recognized by the state. One of the things that occurred back in the 1800s into the 1900s that is a horrible mark on American history is the Indian boarding school system. In the 1880s, it was established along the model of the prisoner of war camps during the Civil War. Probably the most infamous one was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which is now part of the War College. At that school, many Indian children were taken, some by force, some by coercion, and they were placed in the school. Their hair was cut, their regalia was taken, they had to wear uniforms, they weren't able to use their tribal names, they were given alternative names, they were not allowed to use their tribal language, they could be severely punished, physically punished. Many of them died, and their families never knew what happened to them. The graveyard depicted here is the graveyard of many of the Indian children who died at the Carlisle School. The little handcuffs that you see, which obviously could only fit on the wrists of children, that was from the Haskell Indian School, where some of my relatives went out in Kansas. This is a continuing issue. It's a painful issue. Just recently, both Canada and the United States began to uncover mass graves around these Indian schools and are trying to identify remains and return them to their home tribes. People wonder, are there tribes in New Jersey, and don't all Indians live on reservations? Well, certainly that's not the case. As of the 2010 census, 78% of American Indians don't live in so-called American Indian areas. They don't live on reservations. And in New Jersey at that time, 12 years ago, there were 70,000 people who identified as American Indian or of Indian descent here in New Jersey. And our chiefs, the number is probably significantly higher. There are 3 state-recognized tribes in New Jersey with an estimated citizenship count in 2010 of 6,000, and it's higher even now. The tribes that are in our region are the Ramapo Lenape Nation up in the north. Their people are on the border between New Jersey and New York. That's a tribe that is legally recognized here in New Jersey. The Sand Hill Indians are a small community of Cherokee and Lenape people they're not state recognized, but they're historically well documented, and the state recognized tribes acknowledge them. The Powhatan Lenape, they are Virginia Indians that moved up into this area in the 1800s and married remaining Lenape families, and they're in Burlington and Camden County. The Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Tribal Nation is the southernmost tribe in New Jersey, but is very closely related to the 2 state-recognized tribes in Delaware, and that's the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Indian Tribe of Delaware. We're all essentially the same people. The surnames repeat. Everybody else's cousin, just about. Intermarriage has been occurring between those communities for a couple of hundred years. The original people of the Delaware Bay region are the Nanticoke Lenape, and on our little crest it says we are all family. And the reason is because our families have been highly documented as essentially being indistinguishable. We have intermarried for so many years that we are all related to one another. Our tribes are the tribes that have continued around the Delaware Bay, what we call the Pawtucket region, and we were called the Bay Indians by the British. The Nanticoke Lenape communities are extremely well documented and lived in Indian towns, with many of our ancestors living on those reservations that wound up being disbanded on the Delmarva Peninsula. What's interesting about the Nanticoke Lenape is that in southern New Jersey, the families are still in the area that was part of the Indian Fields or Indian Town in Bridgeton, and in the area of Bridgeton and its surroundings. That land had been set aside initially by the Quaker community when our people couldn't have deeded land. And eventually we were able to acquire those deeds, and our families have been in that area since the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, living on those very same Indian fields and documented to have been there all of that time. Our families have attended some of those Indian boarding schools and have been highly documented in federal and state regional records going back into the 1700s. The reason that our people were able to stay is actually a story that's repeated up and down the East Coast for many of the communities of first and early contact. And that is, we were Christianized early on and established our own institutions. The churches became the core of our tribal community. And our people established their own schools and their own churches in the early 1800s. Many of our families were Christianized in the 1600s and 1700s, but had our own institution in the 1800s, and the leadership of the church became the leadership of the tribe. The identity of the church was so central to the tribal community that when there were demographic shifts, there were often church splits to maintain control of tribal governance. The 3 churches that you see here, the top one is in Millsboro, Delaware. It is the Indian Mission Church in Millsboro, Delaware. All 3 are United Methodist churches. The central one is, and the northern one is that's the one on top is for the Nanticoke community, and the central part is from the Lenape Indian tribe in Delaware. It is the Emmanuel Church, And that served as the hub of tribal activity for many generations, actually. And the picture in the at the bottom is the St. John's United Methodist Church in Fordville, which is just outside of Bridgeton, and that is the historic church here in New Jersey. Each of these churches are acknowledged as Indian churches, both by their state and by the denomination. In the later 1800s, there began to be some demographic shifts, as I said, that caused some church splits. By the middle to the latter 1900s, the demographic shifts were significant enough that the government of the tribes came out of the church, and the people organized tribal councils, elected tribal councils and chiefs. The first to do that were the Nanticoke down in Delaware, and the older photograph in the upper left-hand corner of your screen are of Nanticoke representatives, and there is a Mohican anthropologist. The lady there is Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was a Mohican anthropologist that accompanied them as they were representing the tribe to the Delaware legislature. Our tribe reorganized it began the process in the 60s and finished in the 70s, and reorganized with an elected tribal council outside of the church community. And that lower picture on the left-hand side is of those that reorganized the tribe. Our chiefs now are elected. The council is elected. They serve for a period of time. The photograph of the gentleman on the right-hand side is our immediate past chief, Mark Gould, who served as chief for about 40 years. Our culture is not stuck in the past, but we honor our traditions, we honor the past, and we try to pass on those traditions to future generations. Our people participate in the traditional dances that are unique to our individual tribal communities, the Lenape and the Nanticoke. And we also participate in what are called powwow or pan-Indian style dances that come from various tribes and often are used in powwows so that people from different traditions have dances in common that they can dance together. At our Indian style powwows, our Indian powwows are open to the public, and they're a time when our culture is on full display. Arts and crafts, our food, and our dances, sometimes even dance competition for money, where there are prizes. And ours takes place in June. I'll tell you a little more about that as the presentation goes on. All of the photographs that you see here are from our people and powwows from the past. Our community continues honoring our elders and focusing in on passing these traditions to the future. The elders are extremely high. They are highly respected in our community. There's very little that is done without their approval. They are the keepers of the traditions, the keepers of the heritage, and they are honored and respected. And our children are prized, and we try to raise them up with an understanding of who they are. There was a time when our people were very concerned about letting outsiders know about who we were, or letting outsiders do much in regard to studying us, because at the time when I was growing up and years prior, it was thought that the outside community would do harm to us. We were persecuted by the Ku Klux Klan. We were within the living memory of elders that I knew that have passed on now, but within their living memory, they remembered the last removals, which happened in the 1920s in South Jersey, where some of our people were taken out west. And there was this fear when we reorganized in the 70s that if they had their names on an enrollment roll that was passed over to the federal government, that the government would find a way to take their homes and push them out west to a reservation. So for many years, the community had the reputation of being very clannish and self-isolating. It's only been, I'd say, within the past 30, 35 years that we've seen a relaxing of that. And our young people are extremely active in celebrating the heritage out in the public and out in the open. And that's what you see here. The young ladies that are standing under the unity sign were our representatives that went to the National Organization of Tribal Youth that is related to the National Congress of American Indians that I mentioned earlier that I'm a part of. Something that is an interesting bit of history is because New Sweden was in our territory, we have a continuing treaty relationship with the nation of Sweden. And the royal family, when they come into the area, they hold audience with our chiefs. This is a photograph of Chief Mark Gould, the recent past chief, who is shaking the hand of the King of Sweden. My own children helped to open the Swedish embassy in Washington, D.C. when their newer embassy was completed in Georgetown. And that is a relationship that we highly prize. There's some differences, there's a uniqueness to being indigenous that a lot of Americans don't appreciate. For non-indigenous people, their cultural heritage exists somewhere else. And regardless of how it may be suppressed here, how an individual family may not want to continue that identity and change their name or whatever, that culture, that heritage they have exists somewhere else on some other continent. That is not the case for the indigenous cultures. If our cultures are suppressed, it will lead to the extinction of those valuable cultural traits and traditions and stories off the planet. For non-indigenous groups, your self-identity is accepted. Whatever you say you are, that's what you are. People tend not to question it. However, for indigenous people, you have to have the ability to prove your status that has to be acknowledged by a tribe that is acknowledged by non-native authorities. If you are not indigenous, you have a choice to be part of this melting pot that is America, with the exception of the victims of American slavery. Whereas it was actually the policy of the United States to destroy Indian cultures and Indian governments. Tribal sovereignty is extremely important and often misunderstood by non-tribal people. It is the ability for tribes to truly govern themselves, to determine their membership, to set their own laws and practices to protect their own territory. And this is something that American Indian tribes have inherently. It is not given by the federal government. In fact, our tribes predate the federal government, and so does our tribal sovereignty. One of the policies that is well expressed in Felix Cohen's Federal Indian Law, which is a standard guide for federal Indian law here in the United States, is that the American Indian tribes were known to and understood to be distinct, independent political communities, and can exercise powers of self-government, not by virtue of any delegation of power from the federal government, but rather by reason of their original tribal sovereignty. Stereotypes that we are constantly working to overcome include the fact that we don't all look like the Hollywood image from the 1950s and 40s cowboy movies. In fact, most of the actors in those movies were not even indigenous. Our cultures vary across the continent, and this concept that all Indians believe one thing or another is completely erroneous. If you get 10 Indian leaders in a room to talk about a given issue, you'll come up with 10 different perspectives and opinions, just like with any other people. There are some common values that we have, some common traditions that we have that are held dear across the continent, but there are a lot of differences, both regionally and in tribes, and even within clans within tribes, there are differences. Not all tribes want or have casinos. There is this stereotype that all American Indian tribes have, or they were trying to get a casino, and that's not true. Actually, most tribes don't have them, and of the ones that don't, many don't want them. And our tribe is one of them. By tribal law and tradition, we refuse to profit from any form of vice because our spiritual values teach us that will have a negative impact on our people. What we wear our traditional dress is not called a costume. I know that you can find some books where it's referred to that way, but actually that's an insulting term. When a tribal person puts on their traditional dress, it's called regalia. Regalia expresses who you actually are. A costume is what you put on to pretend to be something you're not. Our culture, as I said before, is not stuck in the past. We have continued traditions, but we also evolve just like any other culture. I recently saw expressions of Indian art that looked so much like modern art, it was surprising. Beadwork on basketball sneakers and everything. So it does evolve, and it continues to evolve. There are tribal rappers that incorporate tribal tradition into their rap. Not my cup of tea, but just as a demonstration that we're not stuck in the past. We're not relics of the past. And indigenous cultures, as we evolve and change, those things eventually become some of our traditions over the generations if they are maintained. Just to give you a little understanding of who these people are in the photograph, up in the upper left-hand corner is Chief Quiet Thunder. He was a chief of our tribe many years ago, just recently passed on. The woman at the bottom that is handing gifts to some of the spectators that came to one of our events, that's my wife. And she is a tribal historian and has shared the culture with many. And the young lady wearing a crown is my daughter, who served as a tribal princess for 2 terms and directed the youth program for quite some time for our tribe. And what I need to clarify, when I say tribal princess, I'm not talking about the way people talk about Indian princesses. Within our tribe, that is an elected position as a youth ambassador, where they serve to represent the tribe to the larger community and also at the national and international level. 27 states make no mention of a single Native American in the K through 12 curriculum. 87% of states fail to cover Native people's history after 1900. And this leaves a void that creates a problem, allowing stereotypes and harmful images and inaccurate portrayals to thrive, that ultimately do violence to our people. Those that are interested in trying to figure out how to make a difference have the opportunity to do so, and you have the opportunity tonight by educating yourself to share what you've learned both tonight and perhaps in other settings, to dispel some of the stereotypes and to let people know that, yes, there are American Indian tribes right here in New Jersey. Also to encourage folk to learn more about us and to encourage those who want to learn more about us to learn more by listening to us. One of the things that has been a problem is that so often we are talked about but not talked to. In September 2007, the United Nations passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it covers many issues dealing with Indigenous people internationally. Of the 143 nations that voted for the Declaration, there were only a few that voted against it. Among them was the United States. And even though the others wound up falling in line, it wasn't until 2010 that the United States finally signed on to the Declaration, and with all kinds of disclaimers. We're still trying to make sure that the United States keeps its word. And many of our tribes utilize the Declaration in their resolutions, and in their laws, they will cite this international standard. For those of you who are interested in getting additional information, if you want to take a snapshot of this particular screen, or perhaps it's something that could be provided later by the library, here are a few sites that you can go to learn a little more about my own people. And also there's information about the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs that was established in 1995, and by law has representatives from each of the tribes that are recognized by the state of New Jersey. I want to thank you for your attention during this presentation. I hope that I didn't bore you or put you to sleep, but I'd love to answer any questions you may have.
So first, let me reassure you that it looks like absolutely nobody left. Nobody left the room. Am I echoing here? Okay, so the first question is, can you comment on concerns by all Indian tribes about the departure of younger generations of Indian teenagers who depart from their traditional tribal culture? For example, traditional Amish people are known to leave their culture. Are children, okay, that's the first question. And then I'm going to go to someone else's question, and then I'll come back to the second question. And I just want to say, I will be following up with the slides from this presentation to everybody and a copy of the link for the recording. If you need it fast, be sure to email me and let me know. So back to, can you comment on concerns by all Indian tribes about the departure of younger generations?
I know that one of the concerns is that the opportunities in tribal areas, the opportunities for advancement, for career advancement, often are a challenge. And so what happens is that the community thins out over time. That's been a concern of many of the leaders across the country, that as you would say, the best and the brightest don't have an opportunity to achieve their life goals while also staying living in the community and making those contributions. That's been a concern. I've also heard about the concern of Indian youth that grew up in areas that were hostile to the culture and did not want to identify with their heritage because of that hostility and persecution. And that's been another issue of wanting not to embrace it because of the trouble that it causes you in your life, based on where you live and what's been happening in that area. That's something that winds up in later generations. You have disconnected children who hear of these stories about who they actually are, and they want to reconnect and have a hard time figuring out how. And that's been a problem. All of this causes all kinds of psychological trauma, and American Indians are at high risk of intergenerational trauma. Many of our people have it, and it's because of the history of relationships between the tribal communities and the non-tribal public in the United States. But that has been a continuing concern. And I would say that the number of youth that don't want to identify is not as great as it was years ago. But the number of young people, career-minded young people, who can't find the opportunities that allow them to achieve their dreams whilst also staying in their tribal community, that has been that's a challenge. That's a challenge.
Okay, the next question, please tell us about the beautiful design behind you.
That is a beaded rosette. It is not mine. It's one I found on the internet, but it's a very common pattern. I just wanted a nice image in the background for all of you. But you'll find these beaded rosettes and other beaded patterns on American Indian regalia and other items. It's very, very common. That particular stitch is called, interestingly enough, a lazy stitch. And it's in a circular pattern.
Okay, the next question, how would you want educators to explain the first Thanksgiving?
Well, first is that it's not the first. To say it's the first Thanksgiving is to suggest that there were no Thanksgivings prior to what happened at the Plymouth colony. And the tribal people in the Northeast, the Northeastern Woodlands folk, especially those that are related to us, that hail and descend from the Lenape, had regular Thanksgiving ceremonies throughout the year. And there were all kinds of feasts, festivals, and religious rites dealing with thanking the Creator for the harvest, thanking the Creator for bringing us through the winter. So it was the concept of the celebration is ancient here in this land, which, by the way, we refer to as Turtle Island. of the continental United States. No matter where you go, if you say Turtle Island around tribal people, they will know what you're talking about. And so that's the first thing. It's not the first Thanksgiving. It's maybe the first Thanksgiving of the Plymouth colony, but it's not the first Thanksgiving. The next thing is that there's a different perspective on it. There are some tribes that some indigenous people who actually do not celebrate Thanksgiving, but use it as a day of mourning and protest because of the history. And there are others, my tribe included, that do celebrate Thanksgiving because we don't have a problem with the concept of giving thanks to the Creator. That's part of our tradition. But understand that the story around what happened at Plymouth is one that is not commonly understood. From our perspective and from what we have been told through the generations, through the the descendants of the eyewitnesses, is that when Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag, was out and heard gunfire among the Plymouth community with whom he had an agreement for mutual protection at the time, he and warriors came to see what was going on. And when they found that the colonists were actually in celebration, Massasoit sent his warriors out not only to collect people back from the tribal community, but to hunt for more food. That the majority of the food that was there was actually brought by the Wampanoag. And the celebration happened over several days with all kinds of games, competitions, and fun. And that it was indeed a joyous occasion and a joyous celebration. Sadly, within a generation, all of that changed. And the very people who had celebrated with Massasoit and who could credit their survival to Massasoit and the Wampanoag wound up actually having his son's head on a post after some conflict. So all of that fell apart. And sadly, that part of the story isn't told, and it's overlooked.
We have quite a few more questions. So if you're only able to stay till 8, we totally understand, but we do have a lot of questions. And for those who are writing 2 questions, I'm only asking one at a time and then going on to the next person. If some of the early Lenape were practicing Christian beliefs, why was it that some of their children were taken away to Indian boarding schools? Among the children that did go from the Lenape people, what was the rough percentage that would return to their homes?
The boarding schools weren't merely about Christianizing. There were missionaries among us very early on. Matter of fact, one of our chiefs during the early contact period renamed himself Christian the Indian in the mid-1600s. The early boarding schools may have used the excuse of Christianizing, but actually they were about acculturating and killing the traditions and turning the children into European Americans. So there were children that were already Christian who wound up in the Indian schools, and even though they were Christian in wearing their regalia and speaking their tribal language, they wound up going to these boarding schools, I should say, some of which were controlled by denominations and some were not. And their regalia was taken, their language was taken, their traditions were taken. Anything that signified the continuing link to their ancestry the program was to smash it. Interestingly enough, there were some of the early missionaries didn't do this. When you look at some of the early contact and early conversions, especially when you had native converts that were sent out to minister to natives, the concept of smashing the culture was not, widespread very early on in the 1600s and the early 1700s, but it became part of an actual program and a thrust in the early 1800s, and then the government began to really push it after the Civil War.
Okay, I think you'll be glad you stayed for this question. Are there local Native businesses or Native philanthropic groups that we could support?
Yes. My tribe has, it's called the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Indians of New Jersey, is a 501c3 that it controls, that runs the powwow and also provides social services. I believe that is the same for the Ramapo up in the northern part of the state, the Ramapo Lenape. In regard to businesses, my tribe has two government contracting companies that are federal contractors. So I don't know that, there's much that you could do in regard to supporting them unless you are connected to the government and a buyer. But most of the tribal communities have some crafters that sell their wares online. That's something you can contact the tribe and find out, what they're doing. My tribe has a tribal store where things can be purchased down in Bridgeton. There's also at a regional and national level, donations can be made to various organizations like the Native American Rights Fund, the Alliance of Colonial Era Tribes, are organizations that, would truly appreciate any help.
Why don't you send me some links or the names of those later on, and I will forward that to everybody.
And if I forget, just remind me.
I will remind you. That's a question you don't want to forget. Which tribe would those who resided in Monmouth County, Central Jersey be part of?
Well, see, it's not, if you mean where the tribe's traditional territory is, I can answer the question. But just because you may live in Monmouth County doesn't necessarily mean that you hail from one of the tribes that is for whom that's their traditional territory. But one of the tribes that's in the tribe that's in Monmouth County right now is the Sand Hill community. They have the Sand Hill Historical Association, where there's presentations that are made and things like that. Oh my goodness, the lady's name, I can't believe it's escaping me right now. The Sand Hill Historical Association. The lady's first name is Claire. I know her well. I don't know why I can't remember her last name, but their community is tied to a small area called Sand Hill, and it's very well documented. They're a combination of Cherokee Indians that came up from the south and intermarried with some of the remaining Lenape family in Monmouth County.
Okay, did Indians record their transaction with?
I remember her last name, Claire Garland. Garland is the director of the Historical Society.
Or the Historical Society of?
Sand Hill Indian Historical Society or Association.
All of those words. Did Indians record their transactions with colonists?
Some did. Our traditional way of recording things actually was through wampum. That belt that I showed you, it was a record of the treaty that took place. In addition to that, glyphs, or a kind of a form of hieroglyphics, were used by the ancient Lenape in recording some stories. And there were some tribes that developed their own alphabet. For example, the Cherokee early on. I believe the person that developed it was Shenandoah, actually developed an alphabet, and their language, they use their language now for the newsletters and everything that they have.
Okay. Thomas Penn commissioned the famous painting by Benjamin West called, this, William Penn's Treaty.
Very ironic, because he's the guy who did the walking purchase.
Okay, so is the picture is at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. It's called Treaty with the Indians, 1683. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the 1683 painting was commissioned by the very person who broke the treaty of 1683. And it's William Penn's son and his brother, the two sons of William Penn, who actually orchestrated what was called the walking purchase. They convinced two of our chiefs that, actually three of our chiefs, that there was an old agreement with their father for additional land that was never fulfilled. And because we always try to keep our word, the understanding was, okay, well, let's figure out how we can keep this treaty. They used a forged document, from what I understand, and the agreement was that it would be however long it would take the average man to travel across a certain amount of land, that would be part of what was granted back to the colony. Well, the Penn brothers decided that what they would do is they would essentially get people who were excellent runners, and they would run in tandem, and one after the other. And the amount of land that they were able to acquire because of that was far beyond anything anyone would have thought. And a sizable amount of land was lost, territory was lost in Pennsylvania, and the Lenape that were there were pushed even further west. So it was a bad deal. It was a fraudulent action, the walking purchase. They didn't walk. Let me tell you, they didn't walk.
Are children educated in public schools, home taught, or both?
Both, primarily public schools. Our tribe early on in the 1800s had its own school, along with the two communities south of us. Our related communities in Delaware had their own schools. In Delaware, those schools were absorbed into the public system in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In New Jersey, the children just wound up being absorbed. The students wound up being absorbed into the public school system. So by and large, our kids attend the public schools.
Can you talk about the use of slavery by indigenous people? When was this abolished? Was this done by different tribes?
Well, the first thing I can say about it is that that American Indians were enslaved first here. It just didn't work out because we were able to blend back in. And that's also part of the reason why when many slaves were brought here from Africa and escaped, our people harbored them. The Lenape and Nanticoke harbored them. There was actually a treaty in Delaware with the Maryland colony about having to return escaped slaves because they were being harbored and incorporated into the tribes. It was agreed to, but the practice wasn't really followed, nor were people tended to be returned. And the Lenape actually participated in southern New Jersey in the Underground Railroad. There are tribes that held slaves. There are some individual Lenape that held slaves, but by and large, the slave-holding tribes were in the South. They were called, and are called to this day, the 5 civilized tribes, which is interesting because civilized meant that they were slave-holding tribes. And they included the Cherokee, the Seminole, Chickasaw. You have to forgive me, my mind is wandering a bit, but those communities, by and large, will wound up being pushed west into Oklahoma after the Jacksonian purges and the pushing of many tribes west of the Mississippi. But they were tribes that did hold slaves, and to this day, there are the descendants of the former slaves of those tribes that are supposed to have legal status within those tribes as freedmen. Now, for some of the tribes, the concept of slavery was a little different from what you saw in the rest of the country because there were slaves and there was also intermarriage with the very families that were holding them in slavery. But that has caused some tension because, for example, the Cherokee freedmen were being denied some of their rights, and they fought it and wound up winning because they are guaranteed by treaty to have citizenship in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma.
Could you comment? I'm sorry. Could you comment on the founding of Elizabeth in 1664 and the purchase?
I don't know about the history of Elizabeth. I'm
Okay.
from South Jersey. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry.
Just another clue here, and the purchasing of land from an Indian named, I'm not going to try, Mantano. No. Okay. We got lots more questions. Don't worry. It was mentioned that New Jersey reservations failed. What caused them to fail? Are there former lands known as reservations still used among New Jersey Lenape and other indigenous people for ceremonial or educational purposes?
Well, the one official reservation established by the colony of New Jersey that continued into the federal period, the early federal period. It was established in the latter 1750s and continued till early 1800s. And that was the Brotherton Reservation. It was in Burlington County, in what is today Chemung Township. It was established and run as a mission village by Presbyterian and Reformed ministers. The Brainerd brothers actually were involved in the establishment and the running of that. It had about 70 individuals by the time that it was disbanded. At its height, it had about 200. Not all Indians in the state were forced to live on the reservation. Many would come and go as they pleased. Many remained in their traditional tribal areas, but would visit family and friends on the reservation. The reason it was disbanded, quite frankly, was economic challenges and the desire for the land from the outside community. And the Brotherton Indians, those that were in residence on that reservation, about 70 of them, wound up leaving the state in the early 1800s and uniting with the tribe up in New York that wound up going into Wisconsin and is still there today. There were a few Brotherton Indians that returned. The state for many years told the story that all of New Jersey's Lenape left by then and they were happy to go. That's a blatant lie. They quote one of the leaders of the Brotherton community as stating that you treated us well and you didn't take anything from us. But he was referring to his individual group of 70. He wasn't referring to all of the Lenape in the state. He wasn't referring to the history of many of our people being pushed out. He wasn't referring to those of us who left having to cloister in small areas for our survival. He was just referring to the history of the 70 residents that left the Brotherton Reservation. In regard to do we use lands in New Jersey for tribal purposes, the answer is yes. Our tribe has about 53 acres in South Jersey, in addition to the land held by individual tribal families in the area in Cumberland and Salem County. The traditional grounds are in Cumberland County, just outside of Bridgeton, in a place called Fairton Township, and our ceremonies are held on that land. Our powwow, however, the public powwow, is actually held at the Salem County Fairgrounds every year. And then I meant to say something about that. The second weekend of June every year, that's Saturday and Sunday, is the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape powwow at the Salem County Fairgrounds, and it's open to the public.
Can you talk about the use of slavery by, oh, I did that one. You mentioned there was no discord between Swedes and the Lenni-Lenape. Why was this the case?
I was told by some Swedish historians, because I actually asked the same question. And the Swedish historian said it was because the nation of Sweden at the time was not able to resupply, and there weren't enough of them with military support to become bullies. That's the response I got from a Swedish historian, that the history would have been similar to the tensions we had with the Dutch and the English if it had not been for the fact that the Swedes were at a bit of a disadvantage in comparison. Just what I was told from the other side of the table. So that may be a contributing factor. However, the way that we do celebrate the relationship is the fact that when they came and they cut a treaty for a land grant with us, with our chiefs, and that it was honored until the English came and took over. And by and large, our relationship with the English was with the Lenape was not one of great tension. We had more battles with the Dutch than with the English in New Jersey. We did have conflict with the English on the Delmarva Peninsula, my Nanticoke ancestors.
So I'm going to use this last few minutes to call, last call, put your questions in. We'll give it 3 more minutes. In the meantime, I put my email in. Please email me or chat right now and tell me if I can send you targeted emails about programs like this, and also what you're interested in. I encourage you to come to our library, Union Public Library, Union, New Jersey. We have so much. And if you don't come to the library and you have a library card, if you live, work, or go to school in Union, call us up and we will talk you through the digital resources that you can do without leaving your home. So I'm going to say, this is last call. I'm going to say, in a week of where we make it a point to give thanks, I would like to thank all of you who participated in this call. It was really, in this session, it was really a very meaningful session, especially this week. And also to our speaker, Reverend Dr. Norwood, who is a great speaker, really, really great. And I wish everybody a happy, happy day of thanks. Thanks for coming, and we hope to see you soon at another program or actually at the library. And if you look in the chat, you will see people thanking you. I hope you will, Reverend Dr. Norwood. So thank you very much. Enjoy your week.
We say Wanishi for thank you. So I say Wanishi to all of you, and we don't have a word for goodbye. So we say, I will see you again, which is La Peach Kenewo. La Peach Kenewo.
That's wonderful. Well, La Peach Kenewo, soon. Soon. I guess that's soon duplicated.
I hope you have a blessed Thanksgiving celebration and are full of food by the end of the day.
All right, or before the end of the day, you know, early in the morning. Okay, thanks everybody. Feel free to
Thank
leave.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
Dr. Norwood, and thank you, Debbie. Great program.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Bye, Johnny, and bye, everybody
you.
else. Okay, I'm ending the meeting. Thank you.